Good morning, everyone. A lot of people are still drifting in, but we have to get started to kind of get through today. We have an awful lot to cover. Thank you for those of you who are here yesterday, and welcome to those who are here today for the first time. My name is Gilbert Cook. I'm the president of Anfa, and welcome to the second day of the 2016 Anfa conference. I trust that those of you who are able to attend yesterday's conference opener dealing with imagination, education, and environments were engaged with the presentations. The student award will culminate with the first prize announcement at the dinner this evening. The conference depends on financial support from the community that we represent and what we're about. There are posters in the main hall, and we wish to acknowledge those donors. New School of Architecture and Design, Steelcase, Debris, Vista Paint, Lutron, several anonymous donors, and additionally we thank our in-kind sponsors, the Salk Institute, Qualcomm Institute, Johns Hopkins Brain Science Institute, Doherty & Doherty, and Platt Whitelaw Architects. Bear in mind today that drinks are not allowed anywhere on the marble surfaces outside, especially red wine, and violators will be forced to run for Congress. There will be a half-hour break this morning at 10:15, at which time you are all invited to engage the participants in the contributed poster session held in the lobby. Please visit and recognize the individuals and teams that have earned the opportunity to display their efforts and learn from each other. There will be another contributed poster session at lunch, one at 3 o'clock, and one at the end of the afternoon session. So, we are pleased to have returning to the agenda today Tom Fisher, the former longtime 18 years Dean of the University of Minnesota's College of Design. He is now the Dayton-Hudson Land Grant Chair in Urban Design and Director of the university's Metropolitan Design Center. Tom is recognized as one of the most published academics in his field, the author of 6 books, 45 book chapters, and over 250 major articles. His work revolves around how design can solve problems in areas ranging from public health and childhood obesity to sustainability, education, and government. He bears the title today of Interlocutor for the remainder of the conference. He participated on the Education at the Intersection of Architecture and Neuroscience panel last evening and will be working with us to facilitate the sessions, offer a wrap-up at the conclusion, and edit the proceedings with the synopsis to be available to all attendees. Today's proceedings will end at 5:30. Immediately after that, there will be the final contributed session and a reception held at 6:45 in the lobby. This is a special day. If the fog does not roll in, the autumn solstice will afford a once-a-year sunset at 6:43. Mark that down, 6:43. For the perfect alignment of the water trough that divides the great courtyard. It is unfortunate that construction work will not allow us to walk on that surface, but the view can still be enjoyed, photographed, and remembered from the entry area, and please take advantage of that. Following reception, the Anfa dinner will occur at 7 o'clock in that time space, so please prepare to be out of the area for a short time. Only with individuals with dinner tickets will be admitted. The evening will be highlighted with guest speaker Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, president of the Salk, the awarding of the student competition by Dr. Luis Vasquez, and a tribute to John Paul Eberhardt, the Anfa founding president, and a film, Cathedrals of Culture, the Salk Institute, a film by Robert Redford with a surprise guest star. There are just a few tables with named place cards, and I invite those guests to be seated accordingly. So with that, let's proceed and be on time, and I'm pleased again to once invite Dr. Eduardo Marcano to the dais.
Good morning. It is my pleasure again to introduce our morning speaker this time. Terry Jernigan is a professor of cognitive science, psychiatry, and radiology at UCSD, and the co-director of the Coordinating Center for the ABC Study, which is what she will tell us about this morning. Her studies of the human brain involve non-invasive imaging and have focused on brain development and aging. neurodevelopmental disorders, neuropsychiatric and substance use disorders, and neurodegenerative disorders. For the past decade or so, her central research interest has been the developing human mind and brain, with a focus on the dynamic neurodevelopmental processes that give rise to human individuality. Terry has pursued this interest in collaboration with an interdisciplinary team as director of the UCSD Center for Human Development. She also directs the Coordinating Center for the Pediatric Imaging, Neurocognition, and Genetic Project, known as PING, a publicly shared imaging genomics data resource with data from over 1,500 children aged 3 to 20 years. A member of the Council of Councils of the National Institutes of Health, she also serves on the scientific advisory boards of several research organizations in the US and internationally. Please welcome our speaker, Terry Jernigan, who will talk on thinking about effects of the environment on the developing mind and brain, the ABCD study.
Well, first, thank you very much for this invitation to talk to your august organization. I'm really hoping to learn a lot more about your interests. And I'll be honest, I'm hoping to have enough time at the end of this talk so that you can tell me what we need to do to address some of the most interesting questions you have. But I'm going to spend most of my time today talking, as Eduardo said, about this new study, which just launched this month. And I want to, I guess I can look here. I want to emphasize that this study is the result of the intensive and continuous efforts of over 50 leading investigators in the country, and probably 150 researchers when you include all of their research staff and everybody else. And so I am really here speaking on their behalf at this point. Okay, let me see if I can do it this way. Okay, and because it is funded, in part because it is funded as a cooperative agreement with our sponsors, it's a highly collaborative study with federal partners as well. And there are 8 institutes and centers of the National Institutes of Health. So they really are the primary, NIH is definitely the primary sponsor of this project. But we also have other federal partners already, and there may even be more, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institute of Justice. So let me start with what is the rationale for this study, and then I'll tell you more about the details. Obviously, it's a very large-scale study. You can tell that already. But the rationale is related to the fact that, although everyone knows about the very highly dynamic biological development of the brain that occurs in the first few postnatal years, recently it's become apparent that these dynamic neurobiological changes in the brain that associated with maturation continue for much longer than that, and in fact, they may be particularly dynamic in the adolescent period. In other words, the adolescent period in development appears to have its own interesting neurobiological signature. And so this is something that, unfortunately, has been much ignored for a long time in human development because of so much focus on the earlier period in development. And so this was one of the important reasons why the study was considered to be a priority for the institutes and other partners. But also, I think we all know that adolescence is really a pivotal time in the development of young people. It's obviously a time of dramatically increasing knowledge and expertise and skill, a time when youth find their intellectual and creative voices in many cases. And it's a time when many youth will emerge from this period on a trajectory toward independence and engagement, both academically and socially, and they will become quite resilient to the challenges that they're going to face in the future. But it's also the case that it's the period when the earliest signs and symptoms of a number of fairly serious problems, including mental disorders first appear, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, psychotic disorders. And it's also a time when the behavior of children changes quite dramatically, as we all know. It is normal and even healthy for adolescents to begin to take more risks, become more exploratory. But we all know that risk-taking behavior in adolescents can get them into some trouble because young people become sensation-seeking and risk-taking in adolescence. They can sometimes end up with significant accidents that result in injuries, but also they can become involved with risky behaviors that can get them into trouble. So, for example, early use of nicotine and alcohol and drugs is a very significant risk factor for later dependence, and of course dependence can be a serious adverse outcome for many people. And of course increasingly we are aware that there are damaging behaviors or habits that can develop, and those often develop in this period to some degree. So this increase in risk-taking is both probably a very important and productive and healthy part of adolescence, but it's also a time that increases risk for adolescents. So these are all factors that have contributed to the rationale for the study. And we all know that, or at least from our previous research, we know that genetic, environmental, and behavioral factors correlate with the difference between these kinds of outcomes in young people. There's no question about that. But the problem is that there's continuing considerable confusion or lack of definitive evidence regarding which of these factors are actually causal. Obviously, many factors tend to travel with positive outcomes, and other factors tend to travel with negative outcomes. But it's still a question whether, for example, in young people who develop substance use disorders, the differences that we see between them and kids who don't develop substance use disorders, it's really still hard to tell for sure whether these reflect pre-existing differences between those populations or to what extent they really are related to substance exposure itself. This is one of the critical questions that we're trying to answer, but this is among many different kinds of questions in the study. Okay, so clearly it is felt by our sponsors and by the investigators themselves that if we're going to have effective interventions that help us to prevent adverse outcomes or to promote positive outcomes and protect adolescents in the future, that we need to base those interventions on more accurate models of the effects of all these things that putatively are influencing the outcome in adolescence. And this is why this study is so important, because the previous research, because it has involved many small studies that don't have a lot of context, because the studies have involved diverse methods, it's often hard to compare the results across them. When associations are seen, it's difficult to know which factors are mediating those associations. So for all these reasons, it was felt that it was time to do a more definitive study of this area. Okay, this is what I just said. All right, so here's an overview of the study. We should say that it was initially thought of, if you will, in this collaborative research on addiction entity, which is a collaboration between the National Institute on Drug Abuse, National Institute on Alcohol and Alcohol Abuse, and the National Cancer Institute. This is just a collaborative that's there for addiction science at NIH. And they were the first people to say, we need to do this, because for obvious reasons, substance use disorders often emerge during adolescence, and they felt they were particularly suffering from the lack of information about the normal development of the adolescent brain. But as they began to float the idea and shop it to some extent, a lot of other institutes realized, okay, this is a great opportunity for us to answer other questions that we're interested in that are not necessarily substance use disorder. So many other federal collaborators got involved at that point. The study aims are to enroll 11,500 kids, starting at age 9 and 10, and to find them all over the country. We're going to follow them for 10 years into young adulthood. We're going to use a school-based recruitment approach because we really are determined to develop a cohort who are nationally representative in the sense that they reflect demographically and in terms of SES, gender, race, the U.S. population. So it is driven very heavily by a professional epidemiological plan. We have a professional epidemiological group working with us on this. To be honest, this has never happened before, as much as people have wanted this to happen. And so we really are determined that we have a more diverse representative sample here. We are recruiting 800 twin pairs from twin registries at 4 different sites, because this allows us to ask some questions about the differences between genetic and environmental effects on some of the outcomes that would otherwise be difficult for us to address. We're going to do an extensive battery of neuroimaging. So we're going to be looking at many modalities of neuroimaging so that we can measure both the biological development of the brain and the functional development of the brain, both in terms of its underlying connectivity, but also in terms of its response to particular cognitive challenges. So there's a lot of neuroimaging. We'll be doing extensive health and behavioral assessments. We're going to be looking at activities and environments, and of course that's the focus that I want to have later in our discussion. We're also charged with trying to collect the most informative biosamples and storing them as the children develop so that we can assess some things right away, like their hormone levels, but also either in substance use, when they begin to use. Since they're 9 and 10, there won't be too much of that, but also so that even in the future we may have samples that with developing methods, epigenetic methods, for example, we can ask additional questions down the line. And then we're hoping to add, we have some of these already, but we're hoping to add, as they become available, more innovative, new, novel, wireless or web-based or even nano-engineered assessment technologies that will give us additional information that we can collect sort of passively and that may be more ecologically valid in some ways. Okay, so just so you know, they're going to be a very comprehensive assessment at the baseline assessment in the kids, and we're going every 2 years. We're going to follow up with this very deep, including neuroimaging assessment. But we will see the kids face to face in the interim years as well, so that we'll bring them in every year, and we'll be getting in touch with them more frequently by phone and web, and that will probably become even more frequent as they become teenagers. Okay, so here's an important part of the study, and I really want to emphasize this. The study is being conducted with a new open science model. And so that means that we're going to be immediately and continuously, as a research group, the scientific group, sharing these data with the entire community, other scientists, people in industry, whoever has a federal-wide assurance and can go to the NIH repository and apply, and that's pretty much everybody. As long as they're willing to agree to our data use agreement, they're able to take data from this repository and ask their own questions about it. So, as I said, there'll be rapid ongoing sharing of raw imaging data just after we do some QC. These are kind of some geeky things and not too important, but we'll be looking at some cleaned up sort of, you're going to use a lot of interesting tools to try to denoise and distortion correct many of the imaging modalities that we do. We have really state-of-the-art neuroimaging investigators involved in this study, people who really are at the top of this. And we're also doing annual releases of all the curated data. That's all the different kinds of data. So obviously it takes us a little bit of time to get those data in and check them for quality and find errors and do the derived measures and so on. But those will come out on an annual basis. And we're also going to publish the actual computational workflows, because increasingly there are fairly complex computational workflows that are involved in generating derived, interesting, informative measures about the brain, for example. And so we're going to publish those workflows with the data so that any scientist can take them. They can replicate the findings if they want. They can run these use these workflows to analyze other data that they have and so on. And we're also going to provide support for a web-based data interaction tool, which we call the DEEP. And this would be allowing anyone to come to the website, apply for an account, again, just signing a data use agreement, and then just kind of look and see what is there. Some of it will actually be available even before you have an account, just to sort of figure out what's there in the data repository and maybe even look at a little bit of it in a very anonymized way so that you know what kind of resources might be there. Okay, this is actually the consortium today, and it just is sort of showing you all the institutions that are involved. As you can see, we have the Coordinating Center and the Data Analysis and Informatics Center both here at UC San Diego. And one of the data collection sites is also here at UC San Diego. But there are 19 sites altogether. And again, they're spread out all over the country. I don't have time to tell you everybody involved, but I can tell you it's a dream team of experts across many modalities, because it takes many kinds of expertise to do a study like this. So it involves pediatric neuroimagers, it involves cognitive neuroscientists, it involves pediatricians, psychiatrists, child psychiatrists, adolescent psychiatrists, and I'm just mathematicians, statisticians, epidemiologists, many, many others. Okay, and this is the scope of it geographically, as you can see. I'm not going to talk much about the targets for the cohort, but I just will point out that what we've worked very hard to do is to try to take the distribution. We actually, it turns out that in our catchment areas, we have 24% of the nation's 9 and 10-year-olds. So that's a good start, but within that, we still are not perfectly matched to the demographic of the United States. But we're going to try to oversample in those groups. For example, we're oversampling urban as opposed to rural kids, not surprisingly, since we have major centers with fancy equipment in them. And so we are going to be trying to oversample the rural kids a little bit and try to find those kids where they exist in the consortium, and things like that. And also we're going to be oversampling some demographic groups because they're not perfectly represented in all of our samples. Okay, so here are the main objectives. As you'll see, although this originally came from NIDA and NIAAA, as our federal partners have joined in, this has broadened a lot the questions that we're trying to address with the study. There's a hope that we can develop some national standards for brain development in this age range. There are none, and pediatricians, you know, they have great standards for height and weight and head circumference and all those things, but they don't know much about what's normal for brain development, and we're going to try to help with that. We're really interested in individual developmental trajectories of brain development, of cognitive and emotional development, of academic progress. These are very important outcomes for us. And we're interested in how those individual developmental trajectories are impacted, for better or for ill, by the factors that we're measuring in the study. We also want to look at the roles of genetic versus environmental factors on development, as I mentioned, and we will have this twin design, which will help with that, but we'll also have, we expect to have whole genome genotyping. One of our local companies here has actually offered to provide whole genome sequencing, it's HLI, whole genome sequencing for the cohort over the years, so we're really looking forward to that. And we're going to study the effects of health, physical activity, sleep, as well as sports and other injuries on brain development and other outcomes. We will, of course, be studying, with 10,000 kids, we're going to be studying the onset and progression of mental disorders in some of those kids. And so we want to know what factors influence the course or severity of these disorders, and also what is the relationship between mental disorders and substance use. There's a lot of interest these days in this, and so we need to know more. To what extent does substance use of certain kinds potentiate the onset of mental disorders, or increase the severity, or not, or dampen? These are questions that people have. And obviously to determine how exposure to various levels and patterns of alcohol, nicotine, cannabis, caffeine, and other substances affect developmental outcomes, and vice versa. Why now? Well, because of the maturing technology, for one thing. So the sensitivity, reliability, and feasibility of neuroimaging methods for measuring development of brain structure and across multiple studies where you can combine imaging data across sites and across vendors has been maturing rapidly. And so it's finally kind of feasible to do this. It is feasible to do this. And we've done that in our previous study in Ping, and we showed that you really could do it, and that you got you got all the power that you were hoping to get out of that. Also emerging technologies that measure activity, physiology, and environments. We're really hopeful that we'll get some interesting information from new wearables. And also the maturing scientific workforce. So there now is a critical mass of investigators with experience in these long-term multi-site studies with families and youth, but also this increasing acceptance of the open science model. This is really important here. If we're going to do such a large-scale study with so many people involved, it's absolutely critical that we open up the data to everyone in the community. And I think that also means that we have needed to have sufficient expertise in the advanced computational techniques that it takes to exploit such a large-scale data set. We're talking about petabytes of data here. So rapid changes in the culture clearly have stimulated the onset of, the institutes are very concerned about certain rapid changes in our culture and what their impact is on developing adolescents. Obviously, changing policies and laws with respect to substances, but also the emergence of new substances, synthetic drugs, for example, and new routes of administration of these substances, vaping and dabbing, and people want to know, what is the impact on the health and development of young people of these changes? For policy reasons, obviously. And there are other trends in the society that people want to know more about. What about screen time? What about social media engagement? How do these things, are they making a difference or not? Okay, so this is just this slide you don't have to read. It's just to say, how are we doing the study? And the way we're doing the study is to take advantage of all that expertise out there, put people into expert work groups, and for each domain that we're trying to assess, for example, we form a work group of the most expert people in that field. We have advisory groups. We have other kinds of communication groups. We have design and biostatistics. These are all work groups, and they take groups of our experts, and they work constantly, intensively, I can assure you, certainly for the last year while we've had the awards and we've been trying to launch the study. And that's how we work. And you're going to see some evidence for this when I show you a little bit about some of the assessments as I go forward. Okay, so I want to highlight now some of the advantages and opportunities and also the challenges of this study. So obviously, it's a very large cohort size and a long duration and very high dimensional data set. And this is a unique technical informatics and data science challenge, but also an enormous opportunity for discovery science. So it's both a treasure for us and a great challenge for us. It also provides resources to create a virtually unique big data infrastructure. So we're kind of on the front of the wave of this kind of population science. It's kind of like the precision medicine initiative that I'm sure you've all heard about. There's going to be a very large scale, 1 million Americans in the precision medicine initiative. It's kind of population science, biomedical research endeavors. So we've created here this infrastructure that we can leverage for future large-scale multi-site behavioral health imaging and genomic studies. That's part of what we're doing. And we think this could be really dramatically enhanced by the addition of novel wireless technologies, as I've mentioned before. And so I think, especially for trying to figure out how do we in a more sensitive way, measure an environment, whether it be the built environment or it's some other form of the environment, how can we use new technologies to improve our assessments of that or of an individual's interactions with that environment? I would like for you guys to think about that. It also is an opportunity to pilot and quickly validate a novel assessment method of something that we haven't assessed before, perhaps, in a situation like this, through academic collaborations and academic industry partnerships within this high-profile study. So if you have something you think is important, and you think there's a way of assessing this factor that isn't being assessed, and you have an idea about how we can do that in a sensitive and reliable way, it may be possible in this context to find out pretty quickly, because of the large scale of this study, whether this method gives you at least some convergent validity with other kinds of things that we are measuring in the study that would be expected to be similar in some way. And I think this is one way you begin to validate an assessment of a new kind of experience or environment. Okay, here are some of the biggest challenges that we have in a study like this. What kinds of data do we choose to acquire? Obviously, this train is going to leave the station. All the kids are going to be 9 to 10 when we recruit them. That's the way the institutes wanted it. And so as they get started, this is our chance to figure out what we're measuring across, because we're only going to have one shot at them at each age. And so we have to figure it out ahead of time, and that's a real challenge. We have to choose from the ever-growing biomedical toolkit a feasible set of biospecimens and biomarkers that we're going to collect. We have to choose from an even more complex domain, and that is human behavior. What aspects of human behavior are we going to try to measure as the children develop? And probably the most challenging of all is the one we're focusing on here, and that's the environments of our participants. Because obviously the environment is extraordinarily complex. There are many things that we could measure in the environment, and so that's another real challenge. We know the environment is important. We want to know about how experiences and environmental factors affect children as they're growing up, but what to measure? Which are impacting their development, obviously, and also how do we measure them? Sometimes we are really interested in a particular domain of experience, but there are not well-validated ways of measuring those factors in the environment. And so that's a challenge for us. And obviously, in the end, the goal is to improve existing models of the specific and causal effects of these factors and of the mechanisms that may mediate them. Because ultimately, we want to use this information, we want actionable information, right? It's partly motivated, the study is partly motivated by the fact that it's no longer enough to know that there are many things that are associated with negative outcomes of adolescence. Because if those factors that appear to be associated with negative outcomes are not causal factors, then they are not going to be effective targets for intervention. So you can't change, if you can't bend the curve upward by addressing those factors, it's not useful information. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not useful information. So we have to move beyond models that are really almost all associative models to something that begins to more closely approximate a model of the causal factors. We fully expect that will be many causal factors, that there'll be many factors that exert modest effects on the outcomes. But we have to begin to improve those models so that we can identify those mechanisms that are accounting for the largest percentage of the variability in the outcomes, and so we can address those causal effects in prevention. Okay, so these are the areas. I'm just going to show you a couple. I wanted to highlight some of the ways that we're trying to measure the environments of kids in the study already. So you know sort of what's already there, which unfortunately will be probably disappointing to some of you, but you know, in the context of all the things that we would like to measure. But these are just all the domains. I'm not going to show you all of them. There are long lists of assessments that we're doing in every domain. But just so you know, we are measuring neurocognition, of course, substance use. We're looking at mental health and health, culture and environment. We're collecting biospecimens, and of course we have these mobile technologies. But I want to just show you and highlight a few things. This just happens to be the physical health panel. And this is just highlighting the co-chairs of the work group in our consortium. But I'll just point out that we are looking at sports and activities. So we're looking at kids' involvement in sports, music, and hobbies. And we're looking at screen time as one thing that we're, you know, just what kind of different kinds of interactions with electronic media and gaming and so on that kids are doing. I mean, there are many other things there, but I'm trying to just sort of highlight the things that I think of as really the experience and environment factors that we are specifically including in the battery so far. These are just health. I'm not even showing all the mental health because those are mostly diagnostic interviews, questionnaires, assessments of mood and so on that we're doing in mental health. We have a work group, Culture and Environment, which is co-led again by Raul Gonzalez and Bob Zucker. And they are looking at a lot of factors associated with enculturation and religion, family dynamics, and so on. But I just wanted to point out that there are a couple of environmental factors here we're trying to assess with a neighborhood safety and crime. So we're looking at the extent to which the neighborhoods the kids are growing up in are crime-ridden or safer. School risk and protective factors, again, looking at the quality of their environments in schools from a, in terms of more like what the resources are for schools that kids are growing up in, and the neighborhoods that those schools are in. And then we are doing some biospecimens to look at the environment, and just so you know, we are actually collecting baby teeth when parents are willing to give some of them up. And because this is a new technology that is developing that may give us a handle on very early exposure in development to particular toxic substances, but also substance use by the mother and so on. So there's some data that we can get from about the environment, particularly in terms of environmental exposure of toxins from baby teeth, and get very early historical information. And then again, just we are doing some geocoding. So we will get information. We're going to collect addresses from the kids' history, so we'll be able to figure out something again from that about the neighborhoods that they lived in and what. So really, this is what I wanted to present to you. I wanted to tell you about the study, so you have some ideas what it is and what we're doing already, and I can answer lots of other questions. But I really think that it would be interesting for us to have some discussion about, how we might examine the effects of built environments, for example, on the developing youth in ABCD. What would be some of the questions we'd want to ask? And I'll be honest, I'm selfishly very interested in a few questions about your ideas about what you think the effects of the built environment is on kids developing. What would you expect to be the most powerful effects on developing children? But also, I'm particularly interested in individual differences, as you heard when Eduardo introduced me. And so my experience is that whenever I have looked at the results of effects of experience and environment on children, the evidence has seemed to me to suggest that this very much varies by the individual. Now, obviously, this can vary by the individual because of cultural and social reasons. But it's my conviction that it varies for other reasons as well, that people come constitutionally differently prepared to experience particular environments. So that there is an important difference between how different individuals experience the environment in almost every way. And I've been interested in that kind of variability, as well as the variability that's probably more strongly related to cultural or social factors and so on. And so I'm interested in what you as professionals may have come to understand about the kinds of individual differences that people exhibit with respect to what environments, architectural environments they most want to be in. I'm just interested in this, and so if anybody has any comments on that, I would love to hear more about it, because I'm interested in all forms of individual difference variability, and I'm sure you must experience that. Obviously, architects are often trying to, I assume, really discover from their clients what are their greatest wishes in this respect, and what do they most appreciate. And so I'm just kind of interested in what insights that you could give me on individual differences. I know that with respect to experience effects in general, I'm sure that in this audience you're already aware that for decades now there has been evidence that of neuroplastic effects on the developing brain of different environments. For example, we've known for decades that sensory motor enrichment in the environment is associated with certain changes in the neural architecture in rodent models. Synaptic density or dendritic density and thickness of the cortex, for example, have been shown there's evidence that they're affected by an environment which has sensory motor stimulation in it versus an impoverished environment. That's been in the literature for a long time. There are obviously important long-term behavioral effects, again, demonstrated in animal models of very stressful environments during development versus less stressful environments. There's some evidence like this about long-term. So, I mean, the idea that there are neuroplastic changes associated with the environment has been around for a long time. And recently, it's even been demonstrated that intensive environmental interventions can produce a neuroplastic effect in the adult brain. It's not known at all what those plastic effects are. You can observe them with neuroimaging. You can observe a change in the brain's biology associated with an intensive experience. Sometimes those seem to go sort of be fairly short-lasting, at least if the intensive experience does not continue. But we know that even in the adult brain, there is a neuroplastic effect to intensive experiential differences or environmental differences. So the idea that there are changes in the neuroplastic changes associated with environmental factors, as I think have been around for a long time, we're still trying to understand it, particularly in the human brain. But that's certainly plausible. So I think, we're always interested in how new insights into what factors might really change the developing brain, either in a structural way, like some of the findings that I just mentioned, or in terms of the functional organization of the brain, in a way that would either promote a person's resilience and well-being, or in some way place them at risk. So anyway, I don't want to talk much myself anymore, but I would like to maybe stop and have some discussion, and maybe Eduardo could help us here as well. The consortium.
So we purposely left some time for questions. So while you're thinking about questions, I have a question. I will get to Tom. I knew he was going to have a question immediately. The question is in terms of approach in recruitment, because I can imagine that there's easily 10,000 parents who are like we are and are very excited and want their kids, but they're going to be a select particular group stratum. How are you going to broaden it so that we actually see in those 10,000 the variety of kids?
You could not have asked a more important question. And it has been a matter of intense discussion in the consortium. First of all, as I mentioned before, we have worked closely with an epidemiological group at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. And they have been involved in trying to produce really representative samples in other kinds of studies, like what's a very high-profile study called Monitoring the Future, where they really get very good data in all kids in schools about what they're using. That's basically what they do. And so they have pushed very hard for us to do this through the schools. And the reason for that is this. At least all 9 and 10-year-olds are in American schools. It's very difficult if you have a 9 and 10-year-old not to have them in school. So they're in schools. That's the one place you can go where virtually every child is in that venue. And so for that reason, they've pushed us very hard to try to do it through schools. And so the way it works, when it's working well, is that we submit our catchment areas to the epidemiologists. They look at the entire demographic population of that catchment area. They look at all the schools and all the demographics of all those schools. They choose an initial set of schools that match the demographics of our catchment area with any small tweaks that we have to do to try to get the whole consortium to match the US population. We invite every 9 and 10-year-old, that's the theory, we invite every 9 to 10-year-old in those schools to participate. Now, as we all know, the response rate may not reflect, the demographics of those who respond positively may not match the demographic. But in that case, the next set of schools that we're given to go out to will oversample the demographic who are more reticent to respond. And the idea is that this will optimize our chance of finding kids who are representative of the US population. So that's the initial approach to doing this. There are a number of challenges, however. There are no assurances that a school district will agree. So at some sites, remarkably enough, school districts refuse to even let us send home the information about the study at their schools. Most sites have been able to accomplish this through the school, through the superintendents. But so if you guys know any School 2 superintendents and you have by all means encourage them to participate. But and so a few places they've had problems like that. Even when you have the school superintendent's approval, you still usually have to have the principal's approval, and they don't always agree. And so this is it's not as easy as it sounds, and it's not easy to begin with, but there's some challenges. So we have other ways of doing it, mailing lists, but in all cases, it has to go through our epidemiological team. So we're determined that we're going to try in every way possible to recruit a representative sample, and we think our best chance is to have the epidemiologist in charge. But it's a challenge, and the consortium is struggling because we also have very ambitious targets, as you can see, and the sites are really required to meet these targets. So it's a great question, and I'm determined that we're going to do at least a lot better than previous studies.
It looked like one of the sites was Minnesota. Tom?
I'm Tom Fisher at the University of Minnesota. It's really more a comment than a question. We're a room full of people, there are many architects here who have high environmental sensitivity. We go into this field because we're very sensitive to our environment, but research we've been doing in mainly the African American community with adolescents in Minneapolis has shown that the youth who do relatively well, even in very stressful environments, have a lot of environmental insensitivity. In other words, they manage to keep moving despite the chaos going on around them. And so and I think there's a tendency in the architectural and design community to assume that everybody is as environmentally sensitive as we are. But in fact, it seems to work just the opposite with youth in chaotic, stressful environments. They manage to just ignore a lot of what's going on around them. So it's sort of at that issue of what role do the environmental factors play?
Right. Yeah, I think you're getting at some of the complexities that we face here. And we are very much interested in this question of resilience. But I think we also have to move a little bit beyond this idea that that these are sort of unidimensional factors. And so, we're finding that, for example, environmental sensitivity, some youth may be relatively insensitive to certain things in their environment, but very sensitive to other things in their environment. And so part of what we want to, this is one of the reasons it's so important that we hear from lots of different groups who are, who know what aspects of the environment we should look at, to try to figure out how to come up with a more nuanced kind of answer there. What is, and absolutely, I think you're right that a lot of evidence is developing that some key part of resilience is being able to, be less overwhelmed by things that other people are overwhelmed by. But I think that can be quite context-specific in many cases. So you can have a kid who's very resilient to a crime in their neighborhood, but crumble under some other circumstance in some cases. But you're right, resilience is a factor in itself.
We have a question here.
I was wondering if you... I can speak up on a few words.
I have a mic I could go while that's happening. Oh, okay. This relates a little bit to what Tom was just saying, and it occurred to me that, as was discussed yesterday, kids can do well in less than great environments. And so it is interesting to study this idea about resilience and what that means. But I wonder if the flip side of that is to somehow, I'm not sure how this works in a long-term longitudinal study, but to somehow understand how much either control or agency or ability to modify their environment the kids have. So rather than try and figure out how resilient they are per se, I'm interested in the idea that when kids can make choices about their environment or have some alone time or some self-directed time, they can kind of overcome some of the qualitative, what we see from the design side or from a just social justice or social services side as a qualitative difference can be overcome by some amount of control or agency or ability to direct and change the environment, or also it may relate to the ability to spend time alone, how much time kids are able to be alone and focus, or be alone, and maybe being alone is bad and certain for 9 and 10-year-olds, So maybe there are ways to think about that question and to get at what would be the implications that would suggest that kids have some directed role in their own environment, even if it's not a great environment.
Right, so their autonomy to some extent and freedom. That's a great question. We do have some questionnaires that try to get at this. They're mostly self-report questionnaires, either by parents or for kids, and so to try to get at what parental styles there are, and how much kids experience some sense of autonomy and control. But again, it's always complicated because there's this balance, there's this tension between people who think, well, autonomy is an attribute of the person. That people who demand more, that they're just more they're more assertive in some sense. Maybe what account for the variability. Other people say no, it's really whether your environment gives you that option. And I think that trying to determine what kind of autonomous behavior, what kind of autonomy or control we're measuring is another one of the challenges.
We have one more question here.
I was wondering about how spatially detailed you're going to record or assess the environment. That's the one question. And the other question goes a bit towards the other first questions. Like, what are you going to ask the kids themselves? In what environments they think they can thrive, for example, and how far kind of their voice will be heard in that study.
One of the in terms of, I think your first question was about how much detail we're going to.
Two questions. One about how spatially detailed you look into the home addresses, for example, where the people live, to analyze their environment. And the other question, what about their voice, asking themselves?
Yeah. And I think, the answer is we're probably not doing not nearly enough in either of these domains, but there's so many domains we're not doing enough. So, we will have, again, we have, that's why we're holding out some promise for the geocoding and the information that we can get, because presumably we could get, if a really interested person wanted to go and take our geocoding information and really get detailed information about the physical environment around a child, they could do that. We're not really in a position to do that, but we're trying to collect the information that down the line people might be able to do something like that. In terms of asking families and kids about their environments, there's just a limited amount that we can do in the context of such an ambitious protocol. But we do really hope that as the study rolls out, these interim phone and web contacts may be an opportunity for us to ask a lot of other kinds of more detailed questions about how they're interacting, what their environments are, and how they're interacting with them. And that's where I think creativity at this stage could really pay off. If we can think of the right kinds of questions to begin to ask kids, because they're 9 and 10 now, but we're going to be probably going out to them at least every 6 months, but probably more like every 3 months. And there are opportunities there to do things that we begin to probe in more detail from the kids themselves. What's going on in their lives, how they're interacting, what what they think of their agency is and so on. But it's the future at this point.
Unfortunately, we are on a tight schedule. So it's 9:30. Do we have to stop? I guess we have to stop. Anyway, Terry's going to be around. Hopefully you'll catch her during the breaks and the lunches and so on. Let me just say that we heard yesterday a lot about schools and about school designs. And it seems to me that a very clear partnership could be established between architects and this particularly wonderful, amazing study to figure out what in the designs of the schools these children are going to might be playing some kind of role. Maybe not causal. Causal is a little difficult to prove, but at least correlational, and we can start from there. Okay, thank you very much, Terry.
Thank you.